food early, but you had to go through the security check, and that what delayed all of us. So I know you were on time. To my ministers and ambassadors who are here that I didn't recognize earlier, you are recognized. The Secretary Generals of entities who also were here earlier, I didn't recognize some of you, you are recognized. Our academics who are here, who I'm sure they are already getting the topics for their students or for themselves, you are all welcome. We'd like to welcome our excellencies as you take your seat. And if I can ask His Excellency Thabo Mbeki and His Excellency Moluzi to come as my panelist.
It's much easier for them to hear when the person speaks and they sit here and they come when he finishes.
Good afternoon. Order. Chief of Rapporteur, order. Thank you. We're back again on the session. I'm sure you saw that there were some people sitting there and I've asked them to sit down. The challenge is when you're managing your excellencies in your midst, who are also part of the conveners, they always have a suggestion on the program. So they thought it's best that the panelists only come up after the presenter has finished to make his input. And I agreed with them. So that's the reason why you saw our panelists going to take their seats. We ended on a high note, very exciting dialogue. And I know one of the people earlier said, well, we like the frankness, but it's like it's coming when these former heads of state are out of office. I beg to differ. I had an opportunity of working with them in my other life. They were as frank as they are even today. Actually, I think they were more frank then. And now it's like they are toned down a bit on some of the areas. And I like the robustness that was there earlier on. Now we're moving on a topic that connects with the first one. And I'm sure when we're listening to President Obasanjo, when he was taking us back on the genesis of the problem that causes conflict, he also touched on economic issues, touched on poverty, and what we might need to do in addressing those issues as a means of achieving a peace, security, and stability and development in our continent. So we're now going to have SABC join us to take us through the next session. He will give his input. I'm giving him 18 minutes. He's negotiated for 20, but I said no. Moving towards inclusiveness. Our panelists for that session will be His Excellency Thabo Mbeki, His Excellency Pakili Muluzi, Ebi Chikane, Ayabonga Tawe. Mtabisi Jonas is an activist in his own right. former MEC for Economic Affairs in the province of the Eastern Cape, member of the legislature at the time. He was also in the PEC of Provincial Executive Committee of the ANC in the Eastern Cape. He's also a member of the South African Communist Party. He was just recently a member of Parliament and a Deputy Minister of Finance. Mcebisi will now take us through this topic. I know some of you, the name sounds familiar. He was one of the outspoken people who felt something was not okay in our polity as a country, something that was affecting government in a negative way and also having an impact that is negative in society. And he's one of the activists that says, let's do what is right to save our nation, but also to save our continent. Over to you, Mcebisi.
His Excellencies, former presidents, esteemed leaders who are gathered and assembled here today, and can I just say everybody and all protocol observed. I'm not the best on protocol, I must confess. I must say I'm rather intimidated speaking here today in front of former presidents, great leaders and thinkers from our continent, and whom I hold in high respect. But I thought what I'll try to do, and I'm not going to have a long introduction, I'll get into the substance of what I'm here to do, just to save time. What I'll try to do with my input, and I've structured it quite strictly, I would focus on policies that make societies more inclusive. And the first part will be, why should we prioritize inclusivity? And the second part of the input will deal with which policies for inclusivity have worked and why. And what are the implications for peace and stability where socioeconomic exclusion prevails? And what should be done as core elements on inclusivity agenda for Africa? So I'll really try to be as strict as possible, given the authoritarian chairperson that we have. I would argue that there are three core reasons, and I'm on why should we prioritize inclusivity. I would argue that there are three core reasons why, as African leaders, we cannot afford to ignore the issue of inclusivity. Firstly, it remains an undisputed fact that all our patterns of social exclusion and inequality derive from our colonial wars of dispossession, later institutionalized in political and legal institutions designed to protect the wealth, assets, and interests of colonizers and their comprador elites. Many of our decolonization and indigenization programs have merely served to replace old elites with new ones. Prioritizing inclusivity is therefore firstly about addressing, if I borrow from President Thabo Mbeki, this historical injustice in a manner that puts the poor and the downtrodden at the center of inclusivity agenda. Secondly, there can be no social and political cohesion in Africa with such high proportions of population living in conditions of deprivation and exclusion. The World Bank has found that inequality has worsened within half of African states. Looking at the continent as a whole reveals an even more dangerous truth. The inequality across Africa has increased consistently, with the Gini index rising from 52 to 56%. As a result, Over 40% of the total gain in consumption over the previous decade went to the wealthiest 5% of African citizens. This is a sign that the uneven growth that Africa experienced in the past decades has not benefited the poorest and most vulnerable of our people. We know that income inequality reduces the growth-poverty elasticity of an economy. In simple terms, the higher the inequality, the less reduction in poverty. This means that unless African economies are made to be more inclusive rather than exclusive, economic growth will not lead to large-scale poverty alleviation. And if the livelihoods of hundreds of millions of Africans do not improve quickly, then social stability and security will be threatened. It is no coincidence that the recent rise of populism is anchored in the growing ranks of unemployed youth. Thirdly, African countries will not be able to expand and sustain growth of productive capabilities and output with such levels of inequality. There is growing consensus amongst economists, even now confirmed by IMF, that inequality undermines growth. Countries which have been able to achieve sustained level of high growth generally have low levels of inequality. Education inequality, in particular, constrains growth and inclusivity. The higher the levels of education inequality, the less likely growth will be inequality reducing, with benefits disappropriately accruing to the better educated. Poverty traps in the lower quintiles of population reduce aggregate demand. Continued in education inequality limit human capacity required for rapidly growing economy. And high levels of asset and wealth inequality caused investment reducing political and economic stability and undercut the social consensus required to adjust in the face of major shocks globally. The growth-reducing impact of inequality is also highlighted by a number of other writers, a recent one of them being Denninger, where he observed 54 countries. And they found that there is strong negative correlation between inequality in asset distribution, proxit if you use by land ownership, and growth. They found that developing countries with Gini coefficient for distribution of land in excess of 70 recorded very low levels of growth over extended 30 years. So addressing inequality is also good for the economy, peace and stability again. What causes socioeconomic exclusion? If we don't fully understand the causal determinants of exclusion, we won't be able to craft a clear strategy for inclusivity. While the causes of exclusions are many and multi-dimensional, given the constraints of time, I will single out two sets of issues we need to recognize as principal determinants of socioeconomic exclusion. The first, which I think is rather obvious, relates to the structure of the economy. Economies which are highly concentrated, are extractive and over-dependent on commodities, and highly financialized, or a combination of these, tend to have extremely embedded patterns of economic exclusions. I think there is a direct correlation between levels of rent-seeking and exclusion. Many African economies remain trapped in their historical growth models and unable to overcome their legacies of dependence and subordination in global value chain. Independence saw continuation of self-serving rent-seeking by old colonial powers, often in cohorts with new African rentier class. Unfortunately, many decades later, these patterns remain intact, with African economies too dependent on foreign savings and financial flows for their investment, too reliant on commodity booms for growth and revenue, too vulnerable to global shocks, and with too little new wealth being created and shared amongst those that have been historically excluded. The second causal determinant we must factor into the discussion relates to the voice of the poor and excluded. While by 2005, over 40 countries in Africa held competitive democratic elections, including Kenya, Ghana, South Africa, and many others, there has over the past decade been regression in levels of freedom and openness in Africa. The effects of this democratic progress are visible in the stagnation of governance reforms on the continent. Between 2006 and 2016, Africa's scores on for the overall governance on the Mo Ibrahim Index increased by just 1 point. In 5 years of the past 10 years, that score has actually gone down. And on the same indicators, Africa's performance has deteriorated significantly with regards to corruption and bureaucracy. In other words, the performance of bureaucracy. Although almost every country in Africa now holds regular elections, and recent survey shows only 40% of Africans believe that their last results were free and fair. And just 25 say that they trust their National Electoral Commission. Elections themselves have become means of securing the power of the incumbent, usually to protect and extend the economic interest of a comprador or a parasitic elite. We must connect the dots between the structure of African economies, the rent-seeking interests of elites, and the sustained patterns of autocracy that remain pretty strong in many of our countries. Over the past decade, the trend has been for African elites to tighten their grip on power by reducing freedom of expression, stifling civil society, stoking ethnic and other social divisions, sustaining large patronage networks, and conducting unfair elections. This is something that urgently requires collective attention. Without inclusive political systems where people can make their voices heard and their votes count, the interest of elites will always prevail over those of ordinary citizens. Patterns of exclusion will continue unabated, and peace and stability will remain a distant dream. What has worked? Generally speaking, there are 4 broad policy responses to socioeconomic exclusions. These include direct redistribution, fiscal redistribution, regulation, and what I would call inclusive growth. I will make short comments on each, just to respect the autocracy from the chair. With regards to direct asset redistribution, such as land redistribution, perhaps it has most popular appeal. But I would argue that redistribution of assets, especially productive assets, must be and should be an outcome of inclusivity, not just a strategy for inclusivity, as it is commonly held view. And I hope you get my point. Looking at East African and Latin American countries, it is evident that asset redistribution has a positive impact on inclusivity, but only where there is increased aggregate investment. And so the two go together. And it's important that we make that point. Where asset redistribution is accompanied by declining investment, these measures adversely affect both the rich and the poor. So in context where aggregate investment is in decline, even where inequality may be reduced, levels of poverty also will likely increase as a result of reduced fiscal redistribution, rising unemployment, and many other things that are linked to that. Likewise, the redistribution of assets impacts most on welfare of the poor when accompanied by increased aggregate investment. Growth both expands the fiscal resources available for redistribution, as well as expands the wealth and assets available for redistribution. The second important policy approach for inclusivity is fiscal redistribution. This has been used with good effect around the world to reduce deprivation and poverty. Fiscal redistribution, including progressive taxation, combined with state spending on grants, services, and social infrastructure, is a proven method of increasing inclusivity. Quality public education is the real winner, since it both increases economic growth potential and increases the employment prospects for the marginalized. But fiscal redistribution may have its limits if the structure of the economy is not transformed. And Anderson, in his assessment, I go back to Lula da Silva to be safe, argues that the enormous successes associated with Lula's extensive fiscal redistribution programs and succession of minimum wage increases had an important impact on social exclusion. But they could not be sustained because the structural causes of exclusion were not addressed. So Lula's fiscal redistribution triumphs were meshed with deindustrialization and continuous shift away from value-adding industrial sector towards the financial sector and resource-based extraction. Mirroring many African economies, this has created new vulnerabilities and social tensions as weak commodity demand and fickle financial flows now threaten the sustainability of Brazil's fiscal redistribution package. And this could be applied to probably many of our countries, this same phenomenon. The third set of policy measures revolve around regulation. These include a whole range of positive discrimination and sometimes indigenization policies and licenses, issuing of mining licenses and a number of other things that we use our regulation for. They also include labor market interventions such as minimum wage increase, etc. These measures have mixed successes. They have been less effective when the state is weak and unable to target disadvantaged groups well, when benefits are captured by elites. And then this is a very important point, because I think when benefits, in many instances, the source of conflict arise precisely around how you use regulation to issue licenses, et cetera, et cetera. Either you take ethnic view towards distribution of licenses, or you exclude a whole range of sections of population on the basis of some political considerations, and therefore almost deepen exclusion in that sense. Or when the policies discourage private fixed investment and provoke capital and skills flight, due, for example, the threatened rights on property rights and many other things. Minimum wage regulations and wage-led inclusivity measures have also had mixed results. Generally, they have been important to address pay disparities, which fuel inequalities, and also to increase aggregate demand that stimulates growth. But where wages have increased significantly above productivity increases, this has made firms uncompetitive and led to deindustrialization. The final set of measures are what I could call inclusive growth. Historically, we seem to have veered between two competing paradigms. The one, what I would refer to the trickle-down neo-orthodox position, which suggested that economic growth will lead to inequality reduction. Clearly, this has not worked, and even IMF and many other economists now accept that growth in itself will not lead to inclusivity. The other approach, influenced by Kuznets' hypothesis, argued that growth was irrelevant to reducing inequality because the poor did not benefit from growing economy because of their low capital stock and poor education. And I think it has led many leaders to kind of see growth as unimportant. And there are a couple of interesting studies recently that actually show that I think we need to be more nuanced in actually relating to this reality. The correlation between growth and inequality reduction differs from country to country, depending on the initial structural conditions and policy considerations. Countries that have deliberately pursued industrial policy aimed at diversifying, deconcentrating economic ownership, reducing barriers of entries, and enabling new entrants through access to technology and finance have achieved growth with inequality reduction. So growth also generates revenue for state to pursue other policy measures such as fiscal redistribution and many others. So you cannot discount the importance of growth. And I think that's probably the point I'm trying to make. Growth is important. And I think countries like South Africa already are in a growth trap, quite frankly. And I think it shows itself now in the extent to which poverty is deepening, inequality is deepening, and it also shows that in the levels of political and social instability that we are likely to experience. And that's a challenge. So what's to be done? I'm about to sit down. There is now widespread acceptance that global growth of the 1980s to 2007, often referred to as neoliberalism, based on globalization, liberalization of trade and capital flows, financial sector deregulation, monetarism, and fiscal austerity, has not delivered the anticipated outcomes. Even the architects of global growth themselves, the IMF, recognize that this model has not generated inclusivity. Of course, we also face other challenges now with the Trumps, the Brexits, etc., threatening the whole global investment and trade architecture. So having examined the causes of socioeconomic exclusion and look briefly at what policy measures, I would now turn to what needs to be done. And I'll focus myself on 3 proposals. The first is the need for an intracontinental program of inclusive industrial policy. So, and I think, since you're standing up, I won't get into the details, but it's very clear that that's an area that we probably need to focus on and develop a plan around that. We cannot continue with the over-dependence on commodity trade and commodity prices and the swings of commodity prices. We need to look at that. The second is we must address issues of state capacity. And I think it's very important that we all converge that without building credible leadership, both within the state and the business sector, we're not going to be able to deal with our challenges. But beyond that, I think it's increasingly very clear that in cases where the state has no credibility, growth will remain a pipe dream, because the state has to maneuver different sections of society in a particular developmental direction. And that's probably the challenge. And countries like South Africa, again, because I can boldly say that, we're actually probably in midstream of that challenge, where the credibility of the state is being eaten into and reduced by corruption, state capture, and a whole range of other ills that undermine fundamentally the credibility of the state. So there has to be work done around building the credibility of the state. Credibility cuts in 2 ways, I must say. On the one hand is, what do you do with public resources that are entrusted upon us? The second is building the requisite capacity within the state to be able to do what it has to do. My last point is giving the voice to the excluded. And I think we have to realize that we have to pay a particular attention to the marginalization of the youth and gender issues in our economies, and consciously have active programs that address these issues. I thank you.
Thank you very much for that context and introduction. And I'll keep reminding us that we're focusing on inclusion. in relation to sustainable peace and security on the African continent. Let me welcome our panel to please come up and take their seats. His Excellencies Thabo Mbeki and Bakili Muluzi. Also our panelists Abi Chikane, Chair of Sub-Saharan Investment Holdings and former Chair of the Kimberley Process, and Ayabongwa Kawe, Economic Justice Program Manager at Oxfam South Africa. Please do come up and take your seats. Thank you very much. Thank you. As they take their seats, you know, a few things occurred to me. Moving towards inclusiveness, we've said, makes sense. It is good governance. It's good for the economy, which means it's good business, but ultimately it's also good. Can we just confirm that everyone in this room agrees that inclusion is a positive and critical thing? Are we on the same page? Because, you know, sometimes we assume things when we talk. Are we on the same page? We are, and we go into this conversation now. I'm very happy to confirm on the same page on this issue. We've heard from our opening address that growth itself will not lead to inclusion. It must be strategic growth. And at the end of the day, we must put inclusion at the heart of the development agenda. I'll come straight to the panel and get started. And let me start with Abi Chikane. Abi, from your perspective, the institutions that you've worked for, and whether it's private sector and any other engagements you have had with different stakeholders, what are your thoughts on inclusion? And there are a lot of difficult things to deal with, equity versus equality and much more. Please give us context from your perspective. Do you have a mic? I'm going to request that you don't. Otherwise, we'll have 4 presentations. Please, please. Would you do it conversationally, sir? Thank you. Thank you.
First of all, ladies and gentlemen, may I recognize the presidents who are here with us today and ministers from different countries, and say that for some reason, because I've been dealing with 2 departments within Wits University, one being peace and security, and the other one is governance, legal, and business, I prepared 2 speeches. In fact, I prepared one, which was one on peace and security, and largely because of my background as the founder chairman, if not the co-architect of the Kimberley process. I see my colleague is in the room here, the ambassador. And hence, what happened is that I had to prepare for this. What I would like to say is that I have been engaging the Wits University on a possibility of presenting a proposal to them, and I interacted with the departments across, as I said. And my research in this case is on the state of state-owned entities in South Africa. The reason being that I've been serving on so many boards, and I believe that there is a role that state-owned entities are supposed to play in terms of moving, the economy forward. And I then tried to summarize my thoughts without going into details about this, to say that in the first place, I'm pleased, Madam, to hear in the latest report of the World Economic Forum that there has been a consensus which emerged recently on the need for a more socially inclusive approach to economic growth. Not only did the World Economic Forum agree on that, it then went further to establish, or rather to propose, a set of national key performance indicators to help countries track their improvement. Okay. And these national KPIs have been compiled in a composite global index. What I wish and pray is that I hope most African countries are following up on this, because this index is very critical, and I think it will enable us to have all the necessary information that is required. And let me just shift now to examine the pertinent issues on state-owned entities. At a personal level, Madam, I happen to, as a partner at Ernst & Young, to participate in a global survey where 54 countries participated and about 84 countries participated. I mean, 54 participants and 84 countries participated. And the one thing that came out of that research, which is my thesis for this afternoon, is that in terms of this study, the performance of state-owned entities can match or even exceed that of a private entity, provided its governance and regulatory framework, as well as institutional capacity and capability, are carefully engineered. The research goes further to say that in order to rise to this occasion, a state-owned entity requires a very clear transformational roadmap and a well-articulated process and procedure. Utopian as it may sound, there is a real opportunity for state-owned entities that if they were to operate at the level of a private enterprise and simultaneously been able to achieve its developmental objectives as enshrined in the government socio-economic policies, the National Development Plan, and all other policies of the country, that we should be able to rise to that occasion. A similar research was conducted by PwC, whereby, according to their survey, private sector CEOs believe that government ownership has advantage in certain circumstances, such as furthering social outcomes, providing physical infrastructure, and creating stability in times of crisis within and across supply chain. However, the report is quick to caution that state-owned entities or state ownership can destroy value if best practices in ownership and management are not applied. It further says that of most concern are issues of corruption, bribery, of course, and inefficiency, as Jonas said. And then, of course, I don't want to go through, the rest of it, but unfortunately, South African entities do not necessarily operate at a level that is commensurate with prerequisites of a private entity. Neither do they approximate state entities elsewhere in the world that operate at that level.
Right.
However, this is my point. What is unfortunate in this case is that according to data from both the previous and the current ministers of finance, confirm that the asset base of state-owned entities is over 1 trillion rands, equivalent to about a third of our economy, if not 27% of our gross domestic product. And one would like to argue that these entities should be able to play a critical role when it comes to inclusive growth.
Thank you so much for that, Abby. And then we have to ask ourselves the questions. Why are we not fully, effectively, efficiently managing these state resources to ensure that the people benefit? And I would love, as we come to the floor, your ideas on how we can better manage these state entities. Let me come to you now, Ayabongwa, and your thoughts on this whole issue. And in particular, when inclusion or lack of inclusion becomes a problem for peace and stability, where are those cracks? What are those hotspots, please?
Thank you very much. I just would like to state initially that I no longer work for Oxfam South Africa, and I certainly hope that I'm not expected to speak on their behalf. No. I now work, much to the chagrin of my parents, in broadcasting and working closely with small business in terms of research and policy analysis. I think, to solve some of the big issues that we're talking about here at scale requires not just for us to hone in on the government, but all stakeholders in society. And certainly, if we think about, for instance, the inclusive development that is needed, it requires all stakeholders not just to be at the table, but also to have a clear sense of what the social compact that President Obasanjo was talking about earlier on implies in terms of roles and responsibilities, the distribution of power within that social compact, and also the tasks that are associated with that social compact. And so, the point that I want to make initially today is to say, we can't have this conversation without looking at the economic and sociological roots of violence. Why are certain polities and economies threatened by violence, and under what conditions does such violence happen? And I think the history is very important, and if you'll allow me to briefly go through some of that history, because the defense of the legitimacy and the credibility of the colonial state was often through violence. And so even anti-colonial struggles in terms of how they wanted to engage with that state, the language of engagement, one of the terrains of that language of engagement became violence. And so I often, when I think about this, sort of take heed and take the cue from a Nigerian scholar called Ebenezer Obadare. And he makes an interesting observation about how polity-threatening violence is a sociological phenomenon. And he says that the particular mode by which social agents gain entry into the domain of the state is sometimes through the instrumentality of violence. So people historically have used violence to access the orbit of the state, and so others continue to see it as a viable pathway into that state. Now, I'm in no way romanticizing violence, but I'm saying we need to understand in a very nuanced way how violence is deployed as a tactic to achieve particular ends. Because if we look at it in this way, then it becomes a question of what is it about how we exclude people that makes violence a viable proposition for them in order to access the orbit of the state. And it's about building a new subjectivity beyond just categories that have often been used to define states, territorialism, ethno-focused state and class formation, because in all aspects the state is a site for accumulation and a site to create and form certain classes in societies. Certainly post-colonial societies which have found themselves in transition and flux over the last few decades or so. But then the other question, of course, is then what is to be done? What is it that we can necessarily do, in particular as young people across the continent, not only from a policy perspective, but even from a programmatic perspective? And I want to first say that I think in terms of, if we're looking at it from the perspective of the state, people experience and understand the state at the level of the local. And yet what you tend to find sometimes is that the resources are at the national level and not necessarily at the level of the local. And so there are questions about how do we then create a social compact that encourages creative and very different ways of mobilizing resources at a local level. For instance, the Fiscal and Financial Commission here in South Africa is starting in a conversation as an outcome of a few studies that they've undertaken that looks at what is it that can be done by municipalities themselves to raise money in order to ensure that you have integrated transport systems that are able to undo the spatial divides that entrench exclusion within our society. Certainly the other issues around support for the informal sector, and I think in South Africa we do a very bad job of supporting the informal sector. We tend to criminalize it, and if the activities of the JMPD, for instance, in the city of Johannesburg over the last few years are anything to go by, people in the informal sector who see it as a safety net in instances of high unemployment and underemployment, as we have here in South Africa, are often finding themselves out of necessity in the informal sector. And once they do undertake that kind of activity, we continue to further criminalize them. And that entrenches some form of inclusion, but also it creates the kind of contempt that will often sort of create a situation where violence becomes, because it has become the language of engaging with the state, a viable proposition. I think for me, the last two ones relate to something that the former Deputy Minister touched on, which is around labor market regulation. And I've had the fortune of being part of the national minimum wage process in South Africa, and to have seen how that one lever can be used to ensure that within firms, for those who are already in employment, who are part of the precariously employed and who are part of what we call the working poor, how important a lever it is to ensure that you not only regulate income at the bottom end of the distribution, but you also undertake and you take some steps to implement policy that is able to regulate incomes at the top of the income distribution. Then lastly, I think we are in the 21st century. The fourth industrial revolution is something that is not only imminent, but it's already here. And I think we do need large-scale investment, publicly and also driven by the private sector, into ICTs that will ensure that we don't use digital to further entrench the divides that are already there in our society. It's great to see that some of the initiatives, such as, for instance, Project Isizwe, that are being driven from a municipal level in order to broaden access to the digital and the knowledge economy, are beginning to entrench themselves and make some strides. And I think, of course, as I speak about all of these investments, which I think should be part and parcel of whatever social compact there is between different stakeholders in society, we need to ensure that we build such compacts at a national level and also at a regional level. And I think the question of regional value chains becomes an important one here, not only from a commercial perspective, but also geopolitically, so that we move away from this dependence that has constrained African economies to the point where we can't even plan and foresee into the foreseeable future how we can actually plan around the resources that we have. And by principle, this needs to move away from some form of narrow accumulation by an elite for the entrenchment of whatever personal or patronage-driven alliances, and even some of the geopolitical alliances that are sometimes used as a muse to say we are undertaking a particular path, which is not necessarily in the interest of people, but is couched under some form of sort of geopolitical explanation or some form of justification.
Thank you. Fascinating insights there. I particularly love, the discussion on what we need to do at local level, what we need to do at national level, and the fact that, in Africa, we have to accept that informal is the normal. And we must give respect to the informal sector. They hold up a lot of our economies. They provide a lot of the employment on the ground. And let's give them the respect. Let's give them financial inclusion. Let's give them, and there's so many levels to this. Thank you so much for that. His Excellency Bakili Muluzi, I come to you now, and your perspectives in terms of inclusion. Yes, thank you so much. Please do share your insights with us.
Thank you very much indeed. Why inclusiveness? I think that Minister Jonas has put it very, very eloquently in his presentation. A number of issues that he raised. One of them which I would like to add my voice on is the state capacity and also the credibility of our governments, because that is very, very important. I'll just give you my experience, my own country, when we moved from one-party state to multi-party democracy. One of the things that we embarked upon was to put structures to support the democratic institution which we created. For instance, the issue of the Law Commission, the Human Rights Commission, the Anti-Corruption Bureau, Office of the Ombudsman, the Independent Electoral Commission, the Independent Judiciary, and the list goes on. But also we allowed a number of civil society organizations which were not there, before the multi-party dispensation. I'm mentioning this because this is important. But now we realized after that people cannot eat human rights. They cannot eat democracy. We had to
People
create...
People cannot eat human rights. They cannot eat democracy.
Absolutely.
Wow.
So we had to address the issues which we are talking about. For instance, how do we address poverty of our people? How do we, for instance, create employment, for instance, which the young people are now talking about? We, first of all, looked at education as a very important factor. We said we had to educate our population. In those days, the number of children who were going in primary schools were only 1.9 million children registered in primary schools, which was not enough, a population of 17 million. So we introduced free primary education. We said education is very important. It's a key for national development, a key for poverty alleviation, a key for anything that you can talk about. And the numbers of children moved from 1.9 million children who used to go to school at that time to about 3-4 million children in 1994. This was really a revolution, I may call it. I remember my Minister of Education coming to me and said, Mr. President, what do I do? Where do I get classrooms? I said, that's your job, it's not my job. Where do I get teachers? I said, that's your responsibility. Let's find a way how we can employ teachers and all that, and all that. Now, I'm mentioning this because the issue of poverty is a problem on our continent. We have to do something about that. The challenge we have, I think the population growth is a factor. It's also having to eat our resources, the little resources we have. We have to address those areas. So I really wanted to make a comment on this state capacity and credibility, and particularly when it regards to governments making sure that we save our people, making sure that we show credibility in terms of our service. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that and for the examples that you have shared. President Thabo Mbeki, I come to you now. I think there's a mic right next to you. Look, it's easy to say we're talking about inclusion, but it's actually a huge area and extremely complex. Give us your thoughts on how we start to tackle this dragon of sorts.
Well, Madam Moderator, you've scared me now. I mean, you've said the problem is so big. You know, the topic we're discussing, as you see, is moving towards inclusiveness. That's how it's written in the program. I think I agree with President Muluzi that SABC dealt with a lot of the issues that we need to deal with. But I would start with saying, surely in terms of moving towards that inclusiveness, the first objective surely must be to ensure that everybody is involved in meaningful economic activity. Not inclusiveness starting somewhere else, but in the sense of actual engagement in useful economic activity. You take the continent, for instance, Africa. We must therefore say, in terms of achieving this inclusivity, inclusiveness, let's start in the rural areas. Because that's where the bulk of the population is. What do we do with this population to make sure that we can say it is included in that meaningful economic activity? We discussed this question, the continent, and understood exactly this point. The bulk, 70%, 75% of your African population is in the rural areas. And that includes even a bigger percentage of women being in the rural areas. So if you want to make a movement in terms of inclusivity in economic activity, your rural areas become critical. I'm saying even in the context of addressing the issue of women's empowerment, gender, women's emancipation, what happens to the rural women becomes critical. So I'm saying the continent discussed this. And we decided, the chair of the conference, Thabo Didizade, will remember this in better detail than I would. It decided on what was called the Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Plan, CADA. And it is actually a comprehensive African agricultural development plan, comprehensive. Deals with every element of this. Whether you are talking about provision of seeds or infrastructure, processing, agro-processing, and all of these issues. Irrigation, access to markets, training of people, skilled. So I'm saying that my starting point with regard to achieving this inclusiveness is that kind of inclusiveness. So that we do all of the things that are needed to ensure that this rural population, which is the overwhelming majority in Africa generally, is empowered to participate productively in the economy. In a manner, I'm saying in a meaningful manner. So for not just to say, you can't say, it's okay, let these Africans continue to be involved in subsistence agriculture. You've got to say, no, that's not acceptable. You've got to raise the level of engagement in terms of agriculture. So I'm saying that the first step in terms of looking at this inclusiveness. Then you come to this question. Then you say, we've got an urban population. how to address the matter of the inclusion of that urban population in meaningful economic activity. And this issue is correctly raised about the informal sector, which is typically an urban thing. It's a very important part of the urban economy, as even yourself said. It's informal sector. How do we, certainly not to, it's wrong to and despise them, to treat them as criminals and so on, as you've said.
But how do we lift them?
So what is it that we do to engage people involved in the informal sector? Again, to come back to the question of inclusivity in terms of meaningful engagement in economic activity. So I'm saying that's where I would start with this matter. And each in a question to any one of those issues is challenging. How do you ensure the inclusion in meaningful economic activity of the youth? And your interventions might very well be different as between the rural youth and the urban youth. They may very well be different in certain elements. How do you deal with this matter with regard to women? I hope you are with me.
Yes, we are all with the President, yes?
Before we get to matters of redistribution of anything.
Right.
And you see, it means training programs, for instance. If let's just stay with the rural areas. You say, look, we want to take people out of subsistence agriculture. We must be able to address matters of food security. But we must also create the possibilities for these people to produce enough food to sell to the market. How do you train them to go beyond the stage of subsistence agriculture? You need training programs for that, and etc. So I'm saying there are many interventions you'd have to do to achieve this objective. As the many interventions you'd have to make in order to deal with the matter about how do you upscale people who are in the informal sector in the urban areas. And the point that was raised by Davis originally, which President Bakili has just confirmed, is that very important, because it's obvious that to achieve these things I'm talking about, you need a strong state. But I think in addition to a strong state, you need a progressive leadership. I don't think it's any leadership that is going to do these things. It's a progressive leadership that has got a sense of we serve the people of our country. If you've got a leadership which says we serve me, they're not going to do any of these things. So I'm saying we can start there. And so I don't want to continue further because you are going to stop me.
Thank you, thank you. I do want to come to the floor for views. So very fascinating there, the idea of inclusion around meaningful economic activity, and then ensuring that whether it's rural, urban, women, youth, we're doing the right things to build them up. And I think President Bakili Muluzi talked about education, and we cannot discount the role of education, because what we in essence are talking about when we talk about meaningful economic opportunity or activity is dignity. That you are not waiting for the state to give you things all the time. You are able to stand on your own and earn your living. I also want us to connect service delivery into this conversation, because that's the other really critical aspect of it. As I come to the floor to different stakeholders, I want to challenge one sector in particular. In Kenya, it's a huge problem. I'm not sure how big a problem it is anywhere else, but I want to challenge the banking sector. Enough is enough. Banks in Africa are making huge profits. They're doing well. There's got to be a responsibility towards inclusion for those who need their services. And right now, for a fact, organizations like African Guarantee Fund are coming in to support loans to some of the less privileged. But banks are not passing on the capacity building and even the funding that they are getting, honestly, to the people who need it the most. And I'm openly saying enough is enough. And I hope that more people in this room. Why are governments allowing it? Good. So we all need to stand up and start saying enough is enough. I'm coming to the floor now. Can I see some hands going up? I see them already. Yes. I'll start with the gentleman at the back over there, please. Where is the mic? And then come to the gentleman at the front. Yes. And the lady on this side. I see you. Thank you very much. Yes, sir. Young man, I'm sure you have a lot of energy. Or young lady, where are you? Move a little bit right here to the gentleman there. Thank you. Excellent.
Thank you. I wanted to remark on President Muluzi's point about you cannot eat human rights or democracy. And I want to challenge him a little bit on that one. So, President, I appreciate your point about the importance of economic development and how it is critical for Africa. But I want to submit to you that an inclusive economic development is not necessarily mutually exclusive with democratic development. Democratic development and human rights is a worthy cause that can be pursued together with social development. And would you agree that both respect for human rights, democratic development, and socio-economic developments are goals that can be pursued side by side? And respect for human rights and democratic development is also critically important in terms of creating institutions to hold corrupt political leaders to account. Because we have seen it time and again that the rhetoric of economic development has been used as an excuse for corrupt political leaders to enrich themselves. So would you agree that these goals can be pursued together?
Thank you very much. Let's bring the mic forward, please.
This one.
Yeah, excellent question there. And we'll take two more before I come back to the panel, and then I'll come back to the floor. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Ambassador Muburi Mwita. I'm the Executive Secretary of the International Conference of the Great Lakes Region, ICGLR. And from where we sit, of the 12 member states of that organization, if you ask the one main reason why there is conflict there, it's the lack of inclusivity. If you had that, a lot of the conflicts would be sorted out. But before we know what needs to be done, we must then cast our eyes back and find out when and where did the rain start beating us. It's been stated that in the agitation for independence, Africans and African leaders came together because they had a common enemy, and together, or there might have been a 10% that didn't care to stay under foreign domination, but by far the majority united and did that. Then after that followed 30 years, one generation of independence during the Cold War period, at least for most countries. And I think that's where we lost it. If we look at Southeast Asia, they used that period to forge strong nations and strong economy with great inclusivity. Most of our countries continued the divide and rule systems of the colonialists, so that whereas we won the independence together, we could not agree on how to share the hand.
How do we move forward?
So therefore, that's where I'm headed. We have to redefine and to rediscover what brought us together. So therefore, we need greater patriotism, we need greater inclusivity. As far as elections per se will not bring inclusivity. In many places we find it ushering in a tyranny of numbers of the majority over the minority, and this could be over ethnic lines or over religious lines as well. Whereas in fact it's not the groups, it's not that tyranny group that takes over. It's mainly an elite the nation becomes captive of an elite. So we need to, therefore, broaden access of power and resources. As far as agriculture is concerned, 70% of the population is in the countryside, 70 are youthful. So the state, and that's why citizens pay the taxes, needs to put in systems to ensure that the agricultural produce, we must begin by growing enough food. The biggest tragedy is that we leave 70% of the population in the countryside, but we do not, food insecurity is a major issue. And if we fed ourselves, we would begin from agro-based industries, and then we would move on from there.
Thank you. Our low-hanging fruit is clearly agriculture. To the lady just on the end. Thank you. I see the hands.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And I think that President Mbeki have touched on the main issues of the women and children of Africa, and touching on the rural population. But I also wanted to add another category. When you look at the man-made conflict in Africa that have created another category of poor, we have those that are displaced in the camps and who don't have any way to get out of those camps. The refugees that we see everywhere. We see we touch it in the morning, the migrants and women that are migrants with their children dying in the ocean. So those are the new phenomenon that we have found because of poverty, but in particular because of this conflict that they're experiencing. And when you look at those, and they are not in any data, they are not on any report of anywhere except maybe the UNHCR. So they are the lost citizen. So when you look at that paradox, because when you go to those countries have a lot of resources, natural resources, you know, but in the hand of few people, the elite that we designate, and sometimes the leaders, corrupted leaders that have those resources in the hand, and you don't see the population benefiting from it. I was recently with the Amina Mohammed, our sister in the UN. We went on the joint mission to Maiduguri. Could you imagine? And I asked myself, we met with the Chibok girls that have returned. I met with some women that have returned from the rebels. And I asked them, will you go back? And some of them will say yes. Because if our condition here is not better of where we were, we might prefer to go back to what we see, that those are the criminals. So sometimes you ask ourselves, what is missing in the region where they are living? Where are we failed in our economy to provide them with the food, to provide them with education, to provide them with what? Thank you. I'm coming to solution. I really wanted to go to President Mbeki and President Obasanjo, you know, when they were in power and they created NEPAD. I think the first thing they say, infrastructure in Africa. And they created NEPAD. And now wherever you go, there are new roads, new whatever, new dams, everybody is doing it now. And even though population, we say we don't eat those roads, we need them, but they are everywhere because they said we need to transform the economy. So I'm just wondering myself, if even this new Council of Elders, to think thoroughly on these issues of women in rural areas, by putting maybe a committee, those Veras and others who have the knowledge to put things together, to go in the rural areas to make sure that we have access. It's not just that we put it in paper in the CADEP, but we make sure that we have people, that we have those leaders, that we can push those champions to make sure that we have those initiatives.
Our time is very bad, so I'm going to take two more on this side. The gentleman right there in the blue tie, and the gentleman, the young man at the end. And is there anyone on this side? Yes, I'm trying to take people who haven't spoken yet. So, okay, yes, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. My name is Jonas from Addis University, Ethiopia. I'm very much delighted to hear extremely interesting and moving ideas, particularly on inclusiveness, as exclusiveness is structural violence in most of the cases in African conflict. So I would definitely submit to that one. When we come back to the very idea of inclusiveness, I think we need to define it operationally, what we mean by that inclusiveness. Political inclusiveness, economic, and of course there are many other types of inclusiveness. And at the same time, I, with love and respect to the senior citizen earlier mentioned, you can't eat democracy or human rights. I think man does not live by bread alone. Right. Also, they need democracy and human rights as well. Yes. To be honest, so as to promote inclusiveness, we must have that understanding which goes beyond the here and now, the development question alone. So, number one, visionary, transformative leadership is very much required. That's number one as a solution for us, to be honest, to go beyond the here and the now. Secondly, inclusive leadership itself from the very beginning here. And when we talk about education, I again beg this very steamed brain as the cream of Africa as a whole. Education does not immediately resolve conflict. There are types of education again. So I'm talking about peace education. Some education could be poisoning, to be honest with you here. That's why someone said, let the French and the German change their history textbook, then they can read what each other say about the other one. So I think that's also very important for us to revisit when we say education. What type of education?
What are we talking about? Let's be specific.
Peace
Thank you so much, sir.
Yes,
Thank you so much, sir. Gentleman at the end there. No, first let's go to the gentleman at the end. Thank you. Thank you. I'll try to come back. I'll try. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My name is Jonathan Chiwana.
Jonathan, please go ahead.
I'm a past Uongozi SL winner for 2014, but I practice law in Uganda.
Excellent.
Just to address your concern, Julie, about the banking sector, I think the solution to that is to strengthen technology. I think technology is going a long way in causing inclusiveness. You spoke about Kenya, and I know that the government there, put a law on capping interest rates, but I don't think that's the solution. I think the greater solution should be allowing technology to do its part. I know still in Kenya that mobile money has gone a long way in banking those who previously couldn't be banked, agency banking with Equity Bank in Kenya. And in Uganda too, there's been provisions. I know the central bank is putting in place regulation to allow for mobile money and such things. I think with the government enabling fintechs and mobile money and such institutions to take their place, providing a great regulatory framework, will go a long way in bringing those who previously were unbanked.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, and you're right. And I believe there will be some serious disruptors in the financial sector very soon that will change the game for small businesses. I see a gentleman there. Please, one of you, I see two hands, unless you can make very short, both of you, please.
Very short.
Thank you.
I think inclusiveness is the wrong word. What we should do is Africans don't own Africa. How do we create? Don't copy, don't mimic. Just let's find out a way how we Africans own our resources. Just two examples. South Africa's mineral mining is estimated to nearly 3 trillion. The DRC Congo has resources estimated to 24 trillion. Can I just tell you, all of us will be millionaires if we know how to own Africa. The well-being of Africans must be number one. The safety of Africa must be number one. How do we create a thinking? Can we create a think tank? I will be very happy to help. I'm a professor, and I'm so unhappy always seeing Africa being looted. There's a new book that came out, and you know who wrote it? A Canadian. It's called, what is the name of the book? Do you know the name of the book?
No. What is it called?
The Betrayal of Africa. How Africa is betrayed by Africans. We are the betrayers of Africa. I am also part of it, but by the grace of God, I left Europe when they give me jobs. Even recently, I got an invitation to America to get a job. I said, I will not ever live in South Africa.
Thank you.
I fought my entire life. Apartheid, I will fight also now the outsourcing of Africa to the rest of the world.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Africans do not own Africa, you tell us. And if you actually look at much of the infrastructure, not the new infrastructure, the old infrastructure was always intended to remove our resources. That's how it was all set up. Very briefly, sir, and then I'll take two more. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm Vusi at the University of South Africa, also at the Thabo African Leadership Institute. The question I have is, which is something, of course, most of us are grappling with, is whether the challenge doesn't have to do with the manner in which we approach development in the African continent or in the various countries in the continent. So it's not about perhaps different interventions, which are also very important, doing something on the informal sector, rural development, and so forth, but whether we need to be rethinking the manner in which we approach development. Thanks.
Thank you. Very interesting. If we bring it forward, I'll give these two gentlemen just a few... Oh, there's a gentleman here who has not spoken. Can we have the mic here as quickly as possible? Young lady with energy. Yes. Thank you. Keep coming. Oh, somebody's there. Thank you. Thank you.
Barakanyan is my name. Just one brief question, is especially to Jonas Mkhabisi and His Excellency Thabo Mbeki. My question is, when the people join the long queues during the elections, their expectations is very simple. Their total transformation of their quality of their lives. But why are we still talking poverty even in this era when we have an African freedom? The question is, why, when the economy is growing, Jonas, the poor are excluded? Even when the economy is downgraded, the poor are hit hard. What is the science of economics here that is failing us to understand how this situation can be turned around, that at least the level of poverty can be minimized? Why, following the discourse of His Excellency Thabo Mbeki on the dual economy, do we still have the dual economy today when we're supposed to have the rich and the poor gap being breached? Is it the rocket science really to be debating on this matter when we can able to champion industrialization and localize some of the economic activities and inject the cash to the poor?
Thank you. I'm going to stop the questions there because of time. I'm so sorry. My apologies. My apologies. Is it really rocket science? I'm going to come back to the panel just for thoughts and comments. But Jonas, let me come to you first. You've heard, you started off with your perspectives on the question of moving towards inclusiveness. You've heard everybody speak. We've been asked, is it really rocket science? You referred to the growth trap earlier. I mean, share now what you're thinking, having listened to the different perspectives that have come in.
I think at a broad kind of strategic level, I think one thing that we have not been able to do quite effectively, and I would talk about South Africa, President in particular, it's actually that we have not been able to break the trajectory of our economy historically. We still essentially, despite all the developments that we have, and many African countries are going through the same, we're still over-dependent on commodity trade and commodity cycles, etc., etc. So part of I think, the new thinking that we need to do is, why have we not been able to transform? Why have we not been able to ensure that there's a scaled up manufacturing and value-adding activities of our minerals? And in part, I think, and if you look at it, that some of the challenges we face now are precisely arising from the fact that we have been over-dependent on commodity cycles and etc. So There are 2 points I wanted to make in regard to this thing. The first is that without a very active industrial policy that seeks to identify areas where we have the comparative advantage, build skills and capability around those, and to add value in those areas, we are not going to be able to get out of where we are. So there's a new thinking that we need to do around industrial policy, et cetera, et cetera. But I want to come back to the point. To drive an active industrial policy, you also need a very strong and effective state. And quite frankly, if you look at, I think again, talking to our experience, if you look at our interventions in that area of industrial support, industrial planning, et cetera, we've been pretty weak by and large, as it were. So I'm saying that's the first point. The second point, I think, is looking at the new technologies, the new areas of development, et cetera. If you take, for instance, I mean, what we've done very well, I think, if you look at how we've grown the renewable energy sector, we also need to kind of look at alternative sectors like renewable energy and, of course, different other things, and ICT as was been mentioned.
Thank you for that. President Bakili Muluzi, I come to you now. And the question that was posed to you, I think, challenged by a couple of people on the question of human rights. We cannot eat that. We cannot eat democracy. Would you agree that respect for human rights and social economic development are indeed goals that can be pursued side by side?
Yes, indeed. I really want to respond to my colleague there who raised a question on this one. I think he misunderstood me. I come from a background where I fought for human rights and democracy. During the one-party state dictatorship in Malawi, I was put in prison 7 times because for fighting for democracy in my country. So I'm an advocate for human rights. What I said was, having moved from one-party dictatorship to democracy, we had to put structures to support the democratic dispensation. For instance, the Law Commission, the Human Rights, and all those institutions. The Anti-Corruption Bureau, we put all those institutions. But we sat down as a government, we said, but this may not be enough. We need to create something better. Well, human rights is better, but the people have to be given something, create employment. We have to give them clean water to drink. President Mbeki talked about 75% of our people live in the rural areas. What could we do? So we introduced poverty alleviation program as a program. I remember having asked my Minister of Finance, then I said, bring me a one-page paper. How do you reduce poverty? How do you do it? My mother lives in the rural area. How can she feel that in actually, she's enjoying as a part of the government and all that? Can she get clean water? Can she get a school where her grandchildren can go? All these things are important. But I did not say that human rights is not important. Democracy, I said very, very important. It's fundamental. You cannot replace human rights. You cannot replace democracy. Those are fundamental issues. That's why I was talking about the state capacity in terms of credibility. The issue of corruption, for instance, which is in Africa. How do we address this? So I thought I should just answer that question very clearly.
Let me assist you as well a little bit, Mr. President. So you cannot eat human rights in the context that, yes, you need human rights, but you need more. You cannot eat GDP. You want good GDP growth, but there must be more as well. And so what we are saying is, what is the next step of it? Not discounting the importance of any of these things, and we hear you. Abby, let me come to you now. And, we've just heard from one of our participants here today that some of these people who have gone through atrocities are saying we'd rather even go back to the terrorists because it seemed there was more there than there is here. We see it when people are fleeing across from our continent and dying on the Mediterranean Sea. We see it repeatedly, but you've told us there's an opportunity. We've been told agriculture is one. You've told us, look, managing these state-owned enterprises properly is another. What would you say to leaders right now? What needs to be done ASAP to change the situation? Specifically with respect to the state-owned agencies, Abby, what's the way forward?
I think, first of all, Madam, I have to say that my focus is, maybe I'm a bit ahead of the discussion because I'm more concerned about sources of resources and management of those resources, because we do have resources. For instance, I believe that we should get the banks to do what they need to do. But you already have resources within the state. They are in the control of the state. You've got assets, you've got capital, you've got all of that. And my view is that I don't think we are taking advantage of that. These are our state-owned entities. And secondly, I think one believes that these resources, once they are made available, you will deal with all from rural, women to, all the poor from. Actually, a very touching statistics that worried me a few days ago was when the statistician general said, young people, little kids are poor, but when they grow, they become unemployed. That's a huge problem. The question is, how do you deal with it? I don't think the bank at this stage will be your solution necessarily. We need them. They need to come on board, and there are structures within government that are dealing with it. But I think state-owned entities have a critical role to play, and we need to bring them on board, and I don't think we've been able to do that.
Just before I leave that point that you've raised, what is the problem that we have? Is it too many political appointments? Is it lack of focus?
Yes.
Is it lack of performance?
One of the key issues is exactly what Mr. Jonas raised. It's the quality of leadership. And I'm afraid going forward, there is no hope that South Africa is likely to have any better leadership. I'm afraid to say that. And the reason for that is that when you look at what we are dealing with at the present moment, it tells you this is a precursor for what is likely to happen going forward. So the question is, and I'm talking technically, I don't want to go into the politics of this discourse, but I'm just saying technically, you don't have a leadership that can deal with it.
You're
now
saying
suppose
something needs to change.
Something has to change. The other thing is that why do you continue regurgitating the problem? We know what the problem is. But we need a solution. And the question is, in a forum like this, what solutions are we talking about? And hence I'm saying availability of resources is just one of the solutions.
Okay, you've caused a bit of discomfort. I feel the discomfort, but that's healthy. This is a dialogue, so yes, please. Just on the same thing, we are winding up. So I'd like you, give us some real parting shots on what we need to keep top of mind when it comes to moving towards inclusion.
I hope I won't unsettle the room further, but if I do, my apologies up front. I mean, I'd like to just touch on the thing that you touched on, Chair, which is around, why banks run amok on the continent. And I must say that I differ slightly with Jonathan around the question of regulation. The Deputy Minister touched on how important regulation is as a lever to ensure that you create or you undo a very exclusive economic structure. And I think if you look at, descriptions of the South African economic structure, some have called it a minerals energy complex. Increasingly, some are calling it a minerals energy finance complex. And I think it touched on the financialization. But one of the other things that is an unintended outcome of financialization is, the predatory use of the term of financial inclusion. We saw it, for instance, here in South Africa, where the fiscal transfers that are part of the fiscal distribution we were talking about were actually used because it was outsourced to a private entity, were used to add on and on-sell other elements. So you would go and collect a grant, but other things would be marketed to you. You would have loans that were marketed to you. You would have airtime and a range of other things that are marketed to you. So I think we must move away from this thing that says all attempts at financial inclusion are altruistic by nature. I think a big part of it is also subject to the commercial and at times predatory instincts of finance capital. And I think we also need to be aware of that. The other dimension I'd like to touch on is around this question of learning. And I think any key feature for me of any industrial policy that has succeeded across the globe has been in its ability to understand how you learn from an industrial perspective. And a big part of that, I think now where we are, with the tools that we have at our disposal through technology, is saying how do you ensure that you are able to link the resource endowment that we have to key industrial value chains that you would like to be part and parcel of. For instance, it doesn't make sense that the platinum reserves that Zimbabwe and South Africa sit on don't necessarily lead to some form of industrial strategy that is able to package key learnings especially in the catalytic converter space, for instance, and be able to then have some form of stranglehold on that value chain in particular. And it might apply to many other value chains, and I think that's where, for me, the industrial policy conversation needs to go. But a big part of that also requires regulation that is able to understand the comparative advantage and also be able to encourage and ensure learning.
Thank you. Before I come to President Thabo Mbeki, President Muluzi wants to...
Yes, I just want to comment on this question of leadership. It keeps on coming on. We have been talking about this. I've attended the forums at AU, at SADC and all that, to talk about where is the leadership going to come from. I have, during my time, talked to a number of people, intellectuals, professors, and come and join politics. Oh, no. It's data politics. No, it's data game. So where are you going to get the people? I'm talking about you, ladies and gentlemen, who are professionals. Join politics. It may not be that data that you think. But it's something because we keep on criticizing, and yet you're not available to make yourself available and say, look, it's the truth. I met a professor from the university 2 weeks ago. He came to interview on something else. I think he was talking about democracy. So I said, oh, by the way, you are retiring in 2 years' time. Would you like to join politics? Oh, no. I'd rather do something else. Right. Where is the leadership going to come from?
Where is the leadership going to come from? Get in the mud. It is muddy. Get in the mud, but clean it up. President Mbeki, you have the final word. And I think you said, when I was talking about the banks, what is government doing? When it comes to policy, regulation, accountability as well, as you wind up for us, please share your views. Somebody asked, it's not rocket science,
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to say that I was trying very hard not to be philosophical, but to be as practical as possible in approaching this question, the question that has been put of moving towards inclusiveness. And it was described in the booklet even on it is discussing economic inclusivity, not the political. The political is the next session. It's coming just now. So we're talking around economic questions. Now, the second thing I'd like to say, I don't want to discuss South Africa. We are discussing Africa here. So don't drag me into South Africa. That's a different topic. We are talking about an African challenge. You said what I really want to say is to come back to the banks issue. The African economies, without exception, are capitalist economies. Different levels of development of capitalism. And the banks you are talking about are behaving as any bank in a capitalist society will behave. You can't blame them for being capitalist. It's in the nature of the capitalist system. And one of the inherent things about the capitalist system is that it produces this inequality which Mkhabisi is talking about. It's immanent in the system. So we're faced with a challenge because none of us have dared to ask this question. What is it that we need to do to impact on the functioning of the capitalist system so that it does not produce these negatives, including this exclusion and all of that? We talk about regulation and so on, but I'm talking about going beyond regulation to impact on the manner in which the capitalist system functions. We have not posed that question. Nobody on the continent has. I'm talking about people in government. Maybe academics have, I don't know. But people in government haven't asked that question, including ourselves here in South Africa. And I firmly believe that we will not be able to sort out these problems we're talking about, including this achieving this inclusivity, dealing with levels of unemployment, of inequality, and so on, until we have a look at this capitalism. Here, for instance, let me say, I met many years ago a big German businessman, and he was telling me about, in this process of the reunification of Germany, about how he's in the construction sector, how he was summoned by the late Helmut Kohl, Chancellor at the time, who instructed him to say, go across into East Berlin. There is a big construction company in the original East Germany, which is getting bankrupt. You better take it over. And the businessman was saying it was an instruction from the Chancellor. And we acted like that. You can't do that here. You summon the South African capitalists and say, I want you to do the following. They won't behave in the same way. So we've got to ask ourselves the question, what is it that we do about this capitalist system on the continent? What do we do about it so that it helps to produce the outcomes that we want? And that's an important question. We have no time to discuss it today. And I think, just to finish, moderate, you see, as I was saying, let's discuss these things as practically as possible. For instance, we talk about beneficiation, raw materials and so on. We were talking about this question with the Deputy Prime Minister of Namibia over lunch. And I was saying to her, I'd listened to the Zimbabweans, our neighbors, talking in the past about beneficiation of platinum. We must add value to this platinum. We can't just be exporting. It's a lovely wish, but I knew it could not be done. And the reason it couldn't be done is because Zimbabwe is not producing enough electricity. Smelters need lots of electricity. So you might want to add value to your platinum. It's a very, very good idea. But is it doable? Can't. They couldn't do it. You've got this famous platinum aluminum smelter in Maputo, the Mozal. Very successful, very progressive. The way they could do it was to get, we had to negotiate with the South African electricity company to export electricity from here to Mozambique. Because Mozambique was not generating enough electricity to process that smelter. So we can make a slogan to say, beneficiate. But when I'm saying you come to the practicals now to produce the actual beneficiation, you come across the constraints. And then you've got to answer the constraints. What do you do in order to overcome this constraint? And I'm saying a critical challenge for us here is what's our response to the capitalist system as it operates on the continent to ensure that it does not produce these negatives. But we don't have time to discuss that. But I think it's an important challenge. No. Thanks.
Thank you for that. And you know, it leaves me with, I share this African proverb all the time, and I can't wait for the day that I stop sharing it. What the president has left me with is no matter how many times you milk a cow, it cannot produce butter. And we need to stop milking this cow and expecting butter to come out. Do the things that need to be done to get the results that you are looking to achieve. And no excuses. I think the final words I will leave us with today are, what is it that we need to do to impact on the functioning of this capitalist system? If it does not work for us, how do we reframe it and make it work for us? Because I'll take you to the beginning. Inclusion, we said, is good governance, it's good economics, it's good business, and it's good, period. Thank you so much. Please give a round of applause to the panel. And we are taking a tea break, 15-minute tea break, if we could just get some coffee and maybe even come back into the room. Thank you so much. Thank you.